why Pakistan has never figured up as a story, as a continuous story in any part of the American media.
Almost no country is much of a story. Americans are very, very parochial in their lack of interest in what's going on. The American public knows they have nuclear weapons, and so that's a pretty significant thing, but they're not going to launch them at us, are they? So maybe we don't need to worry. So people who did watch it, I think we're really grateful to learn something new about the world, and I enjoyed learning something. Drama that's going on in Pakistan, just like we would cover the drama that was going on in Kenya or South Africa or Bolivia, Imran Khan. And because there was an idea in the U.S., he was a Pakistani Trump.
He was a Pakistani Trump.
That he was a populist, a celebrity, Biden-type worldview has no question that they can deal with the Pakistan military. A lot of the Trump people see Imran Khan as in a different way.
Is this just Richard Granell, or is this feeling is more widely shared?
It's more widely shared. Yeah.
Anxiety of the Pakistani military establishment that they need to basically do something in Washington. You are in Washington. Do you smell something that they're worried, they're anxious?
A decent number of Richard Grenell type figures in that orbit who want to be able to show that they're doing something differently than America has done in the past.
Has Elon Musk been unleashed by Trump against the European left of the center governments, or this is Elon Musk's personal problem?
Oh yeah, I think this is Musk on his own. Musk is obviously the most powerful, I think probably the most powerful single individual in American history. India-related situation, then all of a sudden in the UK, he's bringing up a 10-year-old story about Pakistani grooming gangs.
Yes.
I think that was an effort to distract from the H-1B and tell, the MAGA base, you might be upset with me about this one particular issue, but don't worry, you and I we hate Muslims equally.
Assalamu alaikum, this is Moeed Pirzada. I'm joined by Ryan Grim, the co-founder of Dropsite, the famous, well-known investigative journalist. In recent years, Ryan has become a household name in Pakistani American community. I have been trying to plan this interview for a number of weeks. Fortunately, I've got time from Ryan Grim. Ryan, thank you so much for finding time for me. I understand you were always very busy, but after the formation of the Dropsite, you are much more busier than before. So thank you so much.
Oh, it's my pleasure. And I think we're in a better place now. Getting it off the ground was a challenge, but I think now it's effectively in orbit and things are moving more smoothly.
So you and Murtaza and your team have put Pakistan on the map of the US print media from 2022 onwards. Now you have become a household name. Our viewers will be very interested to know why Pakistan has never figured up as a story, as a continuous story in any part of the American media. I mean, unlike Latin America, unlike Europe, unlike India, even India is not much of a story, but Pakistan has never been any interest in American media. Why is this so?
I mean, I would start from the point that almost no country is much of a story, in the American media. Like the Americans are very, very parochial in their lack of interest in what's going on, including in Canada and Mexico. It's just, there's also a lot of lack of interest of what's going on, in the United States, outside of, say, election years often. So part of it is that, but I think it's also hard for Americans to get much of a purchase around what's going on in Pakistan. Like they don't connect with the history in the same way as they might with, Western Europe or Canada or Mexico. And so they're like, what's going on over there? There was a military dictator, and they were part of India, but now they're not. Now they fight with India all the time. They don't seem to fight India much anymore. Then they have elections, but the military really still seems to run everything. So it's like, I don't think it's easy to get a kind of handle on. And the American public knows they have nuclear weapons.
Yes.
And so that's a pretty significant thing, but they're not going to launch them at us, are they? So maybe we don't need to worry. So, I think it's hard for them to figure out where it kind of fits into the story.
So you can say anything about Pakistan. I mean, as long as it's Pakistan, it's the military, it's the nuclear weapons, maybe Islamists over
Right.
there. There's some
Yeah.
kind of
Right. The drone strikes. Yeah.
drone strikes,
Yeah.
confrontation with India, terrorism.
Yeah.
So this is
Right.
this is how the Americans get to understand Pakistan.
Yeah. And certainly after 9/11, when Bush did the, you're with us or against us, the American public didn't really care what the answer was from a lot of Muslim countries. Their immediate response was, well, you're against us, no, even if you say you're with us. So there was a deep amount of Islamophobia, coursing through. Well, it hasn't left, but it was at a real extreme certainly in the 2000s, and leading into the wars.
So how Pakistan became an area of interest for you in 2022?
It was really the only. I think it was because I had started doing the television broadcast that you had mentioned earlier, and on that broadcast we're covering 6 to 8 stories a day, and that enabled us. At the Intercept, we were the Huffington Post were covering domestic U.S. politics. The Intercept were covering 1 or 2 stories a day, just major stories. When you're doing 6 or 8 a day, that allows you to have a much wider lens and take in a lot more that's going on around the world. And so I was always trying to bring in events from elsewhere. And even though that they wouldn't necessarily do that well with our audience, in general, a story about something happening outside the United States would maybe generate half the viewership as something going on inside the United States. But the people who did watch it, I think, were really grateful to learn something new about the world, and I enjoyed learning something new and following the ongoing politics. And so we were covering, on a somewhat regular basis. Oh, here's the latest drama that's going on in Pakistan, just like we would cover the drama that was going on in Kenya or South Africa or Bolivia. And somebody reached out who I had known from previous days, and he was like, by the way, I think Imran Khan is doing a lot of interviews now with Western journalists, and I think that I could probably get him on your program if you were interested. I'm like, yeah, of course. I mean, this was after he had left, and so I think interviewing him heightened our audience's interest and heightened my interest in the situation. In my interview, he talked about the Donald Liu and the meeting and the U.S. intervention, and I had vaguely heard of that but hearing him talk, I was like, well, let me see if I can what more we can find out about this, and then that led us to kind of where we are today.
You have now covered the subject extensively. What do you think was Biden administration's problem with Imran Khan to begin with? Because Imran Khan had engaged the Trump administration very well. I mean, things were very frosty between Pakistan and the United States when Trump took over. And Trump became the president in 2017 after winning the election in 2016. And Trump came up, he imposed the sanctions. He was very frosty. He made some very acidic comments on Pakistan. But then Imran Khan was able to engage Trump. They struck off. Trump appreciated him in World Economic Forum Davos Summit. They had a very good body chemistry and everything. But then suddenly when Biden came to office on 20th of January 2021, things became very, very frosty between Imran Khan and the Biden administration. So much so that Imran Khan was never able to, he kept on trying to just give a 5-minute call congratulating President Biden. He was never given the privilege of making a call with Biden. What do you think happened? What went wrong?
I think one thing that happened is that for the first time in a serious way in kind of American, at least modern history, foreign policy took on a much more partisan inflection than had existed before, from Obama to Trump to Biden and now back to Trump. For instance, Donald Trump, as one of his first acts, ripped up the Iran nuclear deal that Obama had signed, and did it, I think, primarily because he was under a lot of pressure to do it by AIPAC and pro-Israel supporters and opponents of Iran. But the fact that it was Obama's signature achievement was something, so Trump wanted to rip it up. That was a new thing. Like, there was, for many years, the saying in Washington was that, domestic, politics stops at the water's edge. That the Republican and Democratic Party would fight in Washington over taxes and the size of the Social Security check, but when it came to American foreign policy, it was a uniparty.
Okay.
And that stopped being the case, particularly with Trump. And so I think, and when Biden came back in, Brazil is another good example. Normally, the United States is always allies with right-wing governments in Central and South America. And from a structural perspective, Jair Bolsonaro would have been the natural ally of the American State Department. But Bolsonaro and Bolsonaro's kids and his entourage had been such flagrant and prominent supporters of Trump that they had taken on a partisan inflection. And so when Bolsonaro tried to pull off a January 6th and remain in power despite losing the election to Lula, who the American State Department would historically be hostile to, the Biden administration stepped in and immediately recognized Lula as the victor and effectively stopped a right-wing coup attempt, which would be the first time in 200 years that the United States was stopping a right-wing coup in South or Central America rather than leading a right-wing coup in Central and South America. And so I think that same phenomenon played a role vis-a-vis Imran Khan, that he became seen, and because there was an idea in the U.S. that he was a Pakistani Trump.
He was a Pakistani Trump.
That he was a populist, a celebrity, and had a lot of the characteristics of a Trump. And I think it's a facile comparison, but I think there's something to it. Like, there are some surface level interesting comparisons. I think one reason they got on so well is they do have similarities. And so I think that actually had a lot to do with the Biden administration looking at him and thinking, can we trust him? And if the alternative is the Pakistan military,
yes,
the Biden type worldview has no question that they can deal with the Pakistan military. So if the choices are those two, a Biden is going to pick the military every time.
Because Biden comes from an institutional background from 1970.
Right.
Senate committees, working with Department of State.
Right. He's been dealing with the Pakistan military for decades, and that's how he understands that relationship.
Whereas Trump was an outsider.
Right. And now I think it's even heightened because a lot of the Trump people see Imran Khan as a Trump in a different way, as somebody who, the deep state, successfully, threw out and imprisoned, and has pursued with the kind of lawfare in the same way that they believed that they were pursued back here in the United States. And so I think that has added an extra layer of sympathy to the situation.
So the kind of commentary was unleashed by Ambassador Richard Granell. Is this just Richard Granell, or is this feeling more widely shared?
It's more widely shared, yeah.
In the Trump team.
Yeah, it's. I mean, a decent amount of the Trump team will say, "Who? What?" Just complete lack of familiarity, and they don't even care. But for those that care, Granell's view is pretty widely held.
because two recent appointments, one for the Department of State and one for a deputy special envoy, they both had made comments on Imran Khan,
Hmm.
positive comments previously.
Yeah, yeah. No, that it's and I yes, he strikes all the right chords for a lot of those people. You know, he feels like it's somebody that they identify with.
So this funny joke kind of an episode of the Beltway grid or something, which you
Yes.
exposed in the last 1 week, right? So do you think these reflect the anxiety of the Pakistani military establishment that they need to basically do something in Washington? You are in Washington. Do you smell
Mhm.
something that they're worried, they're anxious, they're trying to change the public opinion, they're worried for the Trump administration?
I think they are for sure, and you can sense it. The problem for them is that like the amount of corruption when it comes to pay to play policy in Washington D.C. has grown by orders of magnitude even in the last 20 years, which means the price for entrance, into the spaces where your voice is really going to be heard is in the tens of millions now. Just to get in, just to get in the door. Like that's money to hospitals. You can't just spin up a fake AI think tank. You have to give you know 6 to 7 figures to a bunch of different already existing think tanks. You have to hire former State Department and Defense Department officials from both parties. Like the 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 amount of palms that need to be greased to just have your story heard, I think is beyond the capacity of a country like Pakistan at this point.
Very
And
expensive.
so it's very expensive. I'm not defending the system at all. It's thoroughly corrupt, broken, and I think shameful.
Hmm.
But that is the system. And so I guess as a last gasp, if you only have a little bit of money, you kind of make a fake think tank, so it looks like you're doing something. But that's really just that's not going to do it. Um,
So
the
what were they
the
trying to
diaspora,
what were they
yeah,
trying to do with 12 experts that didn't exist? They were never
right.
born, some of them. So where were they sending these stories to? To who? Who were they trying to impress upon?
They,
Who
they
was
were
the
they were sending them to some journalists,
Okay.
and I presume they were sending them to maybe some congressional staffers. And I think the rationale for it would be, okay, we're not gonna win the argument with this stuff, but at least the hope would be that we can throw enough dust up in the air and make it complicated enough that decision makers will just say, this is weird, this is strange, this is messy. I don't want to have anything to do with this, and so they just leave the status quo. And if they leave the status quo, that's a win for the Pakistan establishment. So, so to the extent that there would be some rationale behind it, that could be the best, I guess, that you could
So
really hope for.
you use the word congressional staffers. I think makes perfect sense because in my vlogs I've been telling the people that there are anywhere from 30,000 to 50,000 congressional staffers.
Right.
At the 100 senators and 435 members of the
Hmm.
House. Everyone has 80 to 100, staffers, and these staffers make up the mind of the Congress. If you somehow or the other, bombard them with objective-looking stories on
Right.
Pakistan, like the story I think which caught your attention was the economic disaster because
Right.
of the Imran Khan's movement. How the GDP
Right.
has gone down by 1% and all that. So, do you think they were able to fool the congressional staffer by these kind of, reports being churned from a Washington think tank?
I don't think so, because if a staffer knew what the context was, most of the staffers that are going to get that aren't going to have any idea. They're not following. They don't know what November protests they're talking about,
Hmm.
and so if they won't even read it, they won't look at it. If a staffer does know the context that this is trying to rebut, then they also would know enough to think this is absurd.
Hmm.
Uh, and if there were any economic implications of the protests, they would probably also know enough to know that it was the government that deliberately shut down all the highways and shut down businesses and shut down cell phone and internet service to try to stop the protests that would have led to the economic breakdown. But they would also know, like, come on, really, your currency collapsed, you had a trade deficit and higher inflation and less GDP because of a couple of days of protests. No, like that's not.
It is
Not
also
serious.
a strange kind of cultural complexity, a sort of a inferiority complex. Instead of having known Pakistani experts or people, names, they have invented fake, dead, never born,
Right.
British sounding Jane Austen, Thomas Hardy characters.
And several Lebanese sounding people.
So,
Yeah.
so the
Yeah.
mentality is perhaps they were running it from Pindi and Islamabad, thinking this that by sounding the English and the British names and Western names, they can impress upon the people. They're trying to buy credibility and
Hmm.
trust. It's just like something like that.
It's poignant in that way. It's sad because like you said, it reflects a self-loathing
Hmm.
that is, and I think is is a product of colonialism,
Hmm.
and so I'm not blaming the victim for their self-loathing. And speaking of colonialism, did you notice that they spelled center,
Hmm.
Beltway Grid Policy Center, in the English way,
In
center,
the English way.
C
Yeah.
CENTRE, which is just extra absurd because it's allegedly an American think tank. But I think you're right that when they think of what is an authority,
Right.
they think of the British,
Right.
and so they use the British spelling, even when
It's
they're trying to appeal
very
to the.
interesting.
Yeah,
We're digressing, but it's very interesting.
yeah.
Pakistani military and civil officers are still made to believe this thing that Britain is the real smart power. They really believe in the James Bond movies. They think
Hmm.
Americans are idiots, Britain run the world, British tell Americans how to run the world, Americans only have the power, they're like an elephant.
Right.
The British mind that runs the whole show. So they really seriously believe in the James Bond.
And you can imagine why if you had just a handful of British people in Lahore and they ran, a region of hundreds of kilometers wide,
Right.
and then up until another kind of dozen, Englishmen ran another huge section of it. They do seem imbued with like magical powers.
Hmm. So Britain is big in Pakistani minds. So coming back to Richard Grenell, Trump administration, Pakistani American communities have developed an unduly exaggerated belief in the Trump administration's messianic powers to fix Pakistan. They're just waiting for the
Hmm.
magical day of the 20th January. Do you think it's going to change anything? And I look at it from the other perspective, and let me also put it. Trump would be confronted by CIA, the old machinery bureaucracy of the Department of State, CENTCOM, uh, uh, some Arab countries, Middle East, Saudi Arabia. They're going to tell that the status quo in Pakistan suits us. The Pakistani military has moved away from India. They have identified Afghanistan and the Afghan Taliban as the enemy. Imran Khan was site of a chaotic personality. He's a street agitator. He's not really good for us, and the status quo suits us. Do you think the Trump administration will buy CIA, or they will buy the rhetoric of Richard Grenell?
I think it'll be a real fight because the argument you laid out from an American imperial perspective is a powerful and a persuasive one. But you do have a decent number of Richard Grenell type figures in that orbit who want to be able to show that they're doing something differently than America has done in the past. What I have heard is that there's right now the main jockeying between the elements that you described and the incoming Trump administration is around Ukraine.
Around
And
Ukraine.
around Ukraine. So that's where CIA and whatever you want to call them are going to put all of their energy. And so
Trump is so hostile to the Ukraine project.
he is, yes. Um, and so he also wants. There's also an effort by these Trump figures to force release of a lot of information around the beginning of the Ukraine war, and particularly the negotiations in Istanbul, where they came very close to reaching a peace deal in like March of 2022, and the Trump figures believe it was scuttled by the Biden administration and want the documents released on that. The CIA, State Department, Defense Department, they desperately do not want that story retold and revisited. Pakistan fits into this because it eventually, as you know, was producing weapons, clandestinely for Ukraine.
155 mm
Right.
shells,
Right.
which according to what I've heard is they were selling to a Turkish company, and the Turkish company was selling to an American company, and this is how they were reaching Ukraine and perhaps also Israel, right? So, and they have kept a plausible deniability because they were not directly selling it to Ukraine.
Right, exactly. And so there is also jockeying among the Trump people to expose that arrangement. And what I'm hearing is that the CIA and its allies may capitulate on that one in order to try to win on the Ukraine fight. In other words, kind of throw Pakistan under the bus. So if there was a win for the Grenell camp, it would come because the deep state was willing to just sacrifice it for its higher priorities.
How interesting. So what about the Indian establishment? One important key player of the United States has been India in terms of countering the China. Though India is not black and white against the China, it has the capability and the capacity of playing on all sides. It can censor Russia, it can deal with Russia, it can deal with US. It's a very complex, bigger player. But the Pakistani military has disengaged from India as the United States wanted. They didn't like Imran Khan. It looks to that they thought Imran Khan was far too hyper-nationalistic, So will the Indian establishment have a sort of brief for the Trump administration?
That's going to be a relationship worth watching. We've considered launching our own kind of branch just focused on India and the U.S.-India relations, because it's getting to a place where I think India is even starting to see itself almost as an adversary of the United States.
Adversary?
Right. If getting and moving in that direction, like the dependent on significant commercial relations, and China, is a common adversary, but in India, it has a sense of its own sovereignty that is deep seated, and is filled with bitterness and resentment, around what a perceived lack of that sovereignty over the since becoming an independent nation.
They have an anti-imperial, anti-colonial left of the center. But hasn't it changed with the rise of BJP and RSS and Narendra Modi? That was more of a Congress thing.
It was, but I feel like I think if you witness the assassination program, the willingness to go after Sikh dissidents.
Yes,
in the UK and Canada and the United States, is a flexing of serious power. I think the Washington Post article recently about their meddling in the Maldives, and the fact that was in the Washington Post is all suggests that it's going to be a very complicated dance.
Interesting. So coming to the U.S. politics. Has Elon Musk been unleashed by Trump against the European left of the center governments, or this is Elon Musk's personal problem?
Oh yeah, I think this is Musk on his own. I think Musk is, outside of the president, is obviously the most powerful. I think probably the most powerful single individual in American history.
Really?
Yeah, he has
the big single most second most powerful man in America.
Not as powerful as the president because he can't launch a war. But he by controlling Twitter, he has this incredible ability to control the narrative, to control the kind of public conversation, to drive news coverage, but also to punish individual enemies. Politicians, journalists, activists, they all rely like there are a few that have some independence from it, but so many of them rely on Twitter for their power, for their connection to whatever community that
He controls Twitter's algorithms.
and he can control specifically their account. And he showed recently a bunch of MAGA right-wingers went after him over his H-1B policy, and he nuked their accounts, destroyed a bunch of their livelihoods, and that was noticed. And so to have that, and also to have, to be the richest man in the world, now at the same time that he's as powerful as he is, his interconnectedness and his interdependentness, with China, with India, Mexico, the U.S., like there are a lot of different places where he can be squeezed. So it's an amazing, unprecedented situation.
He's a very intelligent
but I think he's going on his own, trying to build momentum and reshape the entire Western world.
Right. No doubt he's a very intelligent, gifted entrepreneur, electric battery, electric vehicle, Tesla, Starlink, the man, his belief in free expression, as long as it's not hurting him, he's for the free expression, as long as the people are not coming after him, everything is okay. But looking at the complex interplay of history, culture, and politics in the cross-Atlantic world, the relationship between United States and Britain and Canada, and the Western allies, and the history of the West, the Greco-Roman civilization. What does he really know about all that? I mean, he's a technical person. He is
none of it.
Waiting too much. I mean, attacking Germans, I mean, playing up the French, I mean, playing up against the British, speaking on Canada. I mean, isn't it too much?
I think so, and we'll find out. But he's going for it all. It's amazing. And he's backing the AfD in Germany is just an incredible play. This is a far right party for listeners who aren't familiar enough with European politics. The far right in France and far right in Italy barely want to associate with the AfD. They're so extreme and so insane. And Trump, Musk portraying them as the moderate common sense solution to Germany is mind-boggling to people. They are probably going to overperform, if you ask me, in the upcoming German elections.
But why is he doing that? Why is he doing that?
It's a good question. He got in this big fight over with the MAGA base over the H-1B, and
his confrontation with the MAGA base on H-1B, where the MAGA base was also pointing out that in 2023, 73% of the H-1B visa people came from India. The MAGA one started playing it up, and only 9% or 9.7 something percent from India. So do you think that all his reaction is basically stemming from there? He was embarrassed?
Well, I think certainly the thing that he did in the UK, where he went from that India-related situation, then all of a sudden in the UK, he's bringing up a 10-year-old story about Pakistani grooming gangs.
Yes.
I think that was an effort to distract from the H-1B and tell the MAGA base, you might be upset with me about this one particular issue, but don't worry, you and I we hate Muslims equally. So you can trust me in my bigotry. Did that flow into Germany? I don't know. Well, I don't know. He also has so much business going on that we don't know about, or that I don't know about. Like, what else is going on in Germany? Like, what else is he squeezing? I don't know.
So, Tommy Robinson, putting all his weight behind Tommy Robinson, whom even all mainstream British politics hates. I mean, look at
Yeah.
how Nigel Farage
Even the
and
right. Yeah.
Reform Party just moved away from it. They don't want to touch him with the bar full. So he just put all his weight behind Tommy Robinson. And what has his problem been with the Pakistanis or Muslims? Never before we have seen any. I mean, before the start of the January 2025, Elon Musk had nothing against Pakistanis. What has happened suddenly?
I think partly it was about the H-1B fight. He had to ramp up that. I don't know. It's
It's a complex.
wild. Yeah.
But one has to see.
Yeah.
So coming back, in your book Scott, which is your third book, it looks like the hero of the book was AOC, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, right? Where do you see her going in the next 4 years? Do you think she's going to be big in these 4 years?
I think I don't know if she's going to run for president or not, but I think that she's a likely contender. And I think the way that our politics is going, you could imagine her winning the presidency, because the old Democratic brand is so thoroughly debased that anybody who is too intimately associated with it is cooked. And so running another Biden-like person who's 50 years old, I think, like a Gavin Newsom, I think is just not going to cut it for the average voter in these times where people want somebody who's going to flip the table. And AOC maybe seems different enough to be and unusual enough to fit that.
AOC is
people are hungering
5 years of age now.
Right. She actually, people misunderstand this. She would have been eligible to run this time, because she's
35.
Because she's 35, which
president.
You have to be 35. Yeah.
You have to be 35 or 40 to run for the president.
35.
You have to be 35.
Yeah. So she'd be 39 in 4 years.
I started noticing her after I read your book, The Squad, and I think she's very charismatic. She's very clear-headed. She appeals to the younger Americans, to the college students, to the university people, to the minorities. She has a conviction. And I just saw a piece in, I think, Washington Post or something that basically says that, is she going to become very big in the next 4 years? So you think her going places in these 4 years?
Yeah, I think it's possible. Yeah. And she has nowhere to go in the House of Representatives where she serves now. Like the party's not going to let her move up.
She just joined the committee.
Well, right, but she ran for the top position and was beaten pretty badly. Did better than some people thought she would have, but lost terribly. She could run for Senate, but she wouldn't have much more power in the Senate. And running for Senate in New York for her is probably just as difficult as running for president. So at that point, why not just run for president?
In 2029, 28. What is that?
Eight, yeah.
2028. Very, very interesting. Just winding it up, how do you see the confrontation between the Trump and the anti-Trump forces in U.S. within the next 2 years? They have Senate. Republicans have Senate. They have the House. They have the Supreme Court. They have the White House, and they have Elon Musk.
Yes, the having Elon Musk, I think, will make it easier for Trump to keep his people in line. The first 3 months are going to see just an absolute tidal wave of huge legislation that will move trillions of dollars in different directions, and they have a margin of just a few votes in each chamber. So it's going to be an interesting ride. We'll see. So
Ryan, in the last 2 years, you and your team and your colleagues have become a household name to almost all Pakistani American community, and to many people of Pakistani origin, South Asian descent across the world, in Pakistan, in United Kingdom, in Australia, in New Zealand, in Canada. But I also wanted to, before I go into the other issues on which you write, you have written books, I want to basically trace your own intellectual journey from someone who started with drug research on marijuana,
Mhm.
then tried his luck probably in the Wall Street as a trader. What brought you towards investigative journalism?
Well, nothing else worked really. I do have, from a U.S. perspective, kind of an unusual path to journalism. Most of my colleagues, you know, grew up either middle class or upper middle class or better, and then were able to kind of use their, connections that they developed at Harvard or Yale or Columbia to get internships at the New York Times, and then just gradually move into kind of elite establishment media. I was raised by a single mother in a poor rural area of the Eastern Shore of Maryland, and was went to college in Maryland as well, and then out of college moved to New York City. I was working a temp job, met somebody in an elevator who offered me a job at a trading Wall Street trading operation.
In an elevator?
Yeah, totally corrupt, fly by night type of operation, but it paid $300 a week, and I said sure, happy to do this. This will be something interesting to learn about. And actually, the first article I ever wrote was an expose of that corporation, of that company.
Seriously?
Yeah, which was connected to the mob. It was they were founders were indicted. It was not because of my reporting at all. But when I was writing it, a former colleague of mine, this is after I had left, said, like, are you insane? Like, this is the mob. Like, they're going to kill you.
Oh my.
And I was, 22 or 23 at the time. And I was like, they're not going to kill me. And I did, but I did change the name of the company. But
So why were you so sure? Why were you so sure that the mob is not going to hit you? They're not going to kill you?
because I had moved back to rural Maryland,
Okay.
and I was like, and I just couldn't picture the mob showing up at a farm in Maryland,
Okay.
to hit somebody with a crowbar and take them out. Probably stupid, and also, really, I've always been, I think, willing to just take those risks and put it out there, and they didn't. I think nothing that I think they were already in enough trouble
Hmm.
that killing some kid who wrote about them
Hmm.
just what would be much more trouble than it would have been worth. And so by then I had moved back to Maryland, worked in my own middle school, and then went to graduate school in Washington D.C. at the University of Maryland, outside of Washington D.C. And out of that, I got, as you said, this job at a place that was advocating for marijuana policy, trying to liberalize marijuana policy.
So the Wall Street thing, the trading thing is before the Marijuana Research
Yeah.
Center. Okay.
Right.
So
Yeah.
what brought you to Huffington Post?
So, after I left the marijuana policy project, I had been doing freelance writing for several years at that point.
Okay.
But I never considered it something that could be an actual profession. In the U.S., the print news industry was completely collapsing at the time. I didn't know anybody growing up who had ever kind of made a living as a journalist. I liked doing it as a hobby, but I just couldn't conceive of it. But then I found myself unemployed, and a friend of mine said, "Look, you've always been doing such interesting kind of freelance work. Why don't you try to make a run of it?" And he wrote for the magazine called The Nation here in the U.S. And he said, "Look, I'm in Bolivia right now, and The Nation I have a translator and I have a driver, and I think that there's going to be an uprising that will overthrow the president within the next week. If you come down, we can travel around, and
To
you can
Bolivia.
to Bolivia, and you can use my interpreter and my and my fixer, and you try to sell some stories from there. And I said, great, I'm in. And I said, let's do it. Let's try. Let's just try to do this thing of journalism. And I went down, and
you knew
we
something about Bolivia at that point?
No. I mean, I've always been curious, and I've always been well read, and so I probably knew a lot more than the kind of average 25-year-old in America, but not much more at all. And my Spanish was not very. It was okay. You know, you could ask some questions in the street, but it wasn't as if I spoke decent Spanish. But we were we toured the Chipari for a couple of days, interviewing a lot of coca growers and leaders of the opposition there. And in the airport on the way back to La Paz, we happened to be on the exact same flight as Evo Morales, and so we were able to interview him right there in the right there in the airport.
What a lucky stroke!
Incredible. Although, so here we are. It's a very small plane, and it's about a 35 to 50-minute flight from Cochabamba to La Paz, and it's an amazing flight because you take off and you never land because La Paz is so high. La Paz is several miles up in altitude, and the Chipari is down at sea level. Right. So it's this amazing feeling. Like you take off, you're
go up and up and up,
and then land.
Okay.
You never go down. It's an incredible feeling. But what was so scary about it is, like, by this point, we knew the entire public knew that Morales was going to try to overthrow the government. Like, he had announced.
Overthrow the government.
Yeah, he was not president yet. He was the leader of the Coca Growers Union, which is the most powerful union in the country.
Querido pueblo aymara, quechua, querido pueblo boliviano.
I don't know how long 10 years have gone by working for our revolution. 10 years of changes. Brothers, leaders, reflect. You have given us the stability that brought prosperity to Bolivia.
And he had announced that he was going to have a nationwide protest, and that they were going to shut down La Paz, which is easy to shut down because it's this elevated city, and there's only a few ways in and out. And so if you can, with thousands of people, blockade each way in and out, you can shut the entire city down. And he had announced that this was going to happen. So here we are. We have our tickets to get on the same flight as him, but now you're flying into La Paz, with the leader of a leftist uprising,
rebel,
who has announced his intentions.
Who's a rebel?
Yeah, these planes have been known not to land, or not to land safely. And so my friend and I said, should we take the next flight? And we said, let's go for it. It'll probably land. And when it did land, and it landed in the sky, like I said, it's such a strange feeling. Like, how are we going to get out at this point? And like, how are we possibly on the ground? It's the craziest feeling. And then a couple days later, he did successfully pressure. There were some people killed in the streets, and there was a lot of tear gas and a lot of action. But Carlos Mesa, the president at the time, resigned. And then Evo Morales ran in the upcoming elections and was elected president and served until 2018. And then his part,
Is this the beginning of the Huffington Post career as well?
Huffington Post barely existed at this point. So this would have been 2005.
2009 you joined Huffington Post.
Yeah, Huffington Post, I think, launched around 2006-07. My first job was with the Washington City paper, which is a local paper here. And then I worked for Politico for 2 years, which is much more mainstream kind of national political publication. And then I became the kind of first reporter for the Huffington Post, which at the time was only kind of aggregating news from other outlets. I was the first one that had previous journalistic
But
experience.
you became the bureau chief for Huffington Post in Washington.
Right. That's because the bureau was like 4 people. So, it was a very extremely small bureau. So I wouldn't have been qualified at that point to run, a bureau of any reasonable size. But because we grew so slowly at first and then rapidly, it gave me an interesting experience. I think by 2011 or 12, we had maybe 60 people in our Washington bureau, and and stayed a serious powerhouse in Washington, throughout the Obama administration. And then I was, to answer your question about why I left the Huffington Post, Ariana Huffington left in the middle of 2016. And
Ariana was the founder?
She was the founder, right. And I was then floated as a potential editor-in-chief to replace her.
Okay.
And I actually took myself out of the running after Trump won. I said, I don't want to go to New York and run the Huffington Post. I'd rather stay in D.C. and cover the politics of this. However, the new editor-in-chief that they did hire basically wanted to clean house of the old guard, as it's fairly common. But it was done in a respectful way. It was just some hint, nudge, like the old guard should go find somewhere else to go.
Right.
Whenever you can, but not too long.
Has Huffington Post changed its direction after that? Is it less of a left now?
It's still left, but I think what I was able to bring to it was more of a kind of crusading journalistic attitude, that we would pick stories that we wanted to crusade on in the old kind of tabloid style, or the old kind of muckraker style from the early 20th century, and just ride those stories. Whereas it's diminished now in its capacity as well. I think it's probably 1/10 of the size of what it used to be.
Interesting. Thank you so much for joining me, and thank you so much.
Yes.
Okay.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
And looking forward to staying in touch. Thank you. Bye.